Okay, good morning and welcome to the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub. My name's John Wiseman. I'm a research fellow here at the college and the hub, and I'm really thank you for coming along to this presentation by Dr. Jan Steckel on, as you can see, coal, climate change mitigation and populism, which we should cover off fairly easily in half an hour or so. I think that'll be terrain that we can cover quite quickly. No, of course, actually, there's a whole range of issues that we'll hope to open up. So 2 or 3, before I introduce Jan, just a couple of introductory points. Firstly, I would, of course, like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Secondly, I've been asked to point out the emergency exits, not that we are planning to need them, but it's a standard procedure. So there is an exit there and of course down the stairs. And lastly, just to note when we do get to questions, and Jan will speak for about 30, 40 minutes, and then there will be time for 15, 20 minutes of questions. I will ask you to use the microphones because we are recording and indeed streaming the session, so it's important for people to be able to hear your questions. So I'd like to now really welcome and introduce Jan. He heads up the working group Climate and Development at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin. He received his PhD in economics from TU Berlin and a master's degree in industrial engineering from the University of Flensburg and the University of Southern Denmark. From 2007 to 2013, he worked at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research prior to starting at Mercator. He's written widely on the political economy and distributional impacts of climate change mitigation, with a particular focus on developing and emerging economies. He's been an author of the IPC Special Report on Renewables and its 5th assessment report, and led a chapter on phasing out of coal for the 2017 UNEP emissions gap report. So yes, I'll ask Jan to speak, as I said, for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you all for being here. I'm quite excited because actually I'm on leave. I'm on parental leave traveling in Australia and New Zealand, and John was so kind actually inviting me to give a talk here while I was actually on leave. So it is actually my second talk I give during my leave, and so the excitement has already a little bit eased, but still it is great also to stand in front of a large audience like you guys again. So let me start. So today I would like to talk a little bit about coal, climate change mitigation and populism, and I would like to basically draw mostly on work that we have done at MCC, but of course also looking at here and there and at what is happening in the world outside MCC. So it is definitely a timely topic. So last year we have actually a new sad record that the greenhouse gas concentrations have reached a record high, above 400 ppm of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. I remember when I started in this business of climate change economics, actually we still ran scenarios without overshoot where we actually said 400 ppm is more or less the limit. So we have passed this. Then, and this is a little bit the subtitle of my talk too. So the New York Times was already in November, December, had a large op-ed where they actually ask, why is it so hard to quit coal? And shows actually how important it is. And when I was preparing for this talk, I have found this article in The Economist of last year. So learned a little bit about the troubling signs for the future of Australia's giant coal industry, which I personally perceive to be rather goodish news, but I think it still doesn't mean that phasing out coal is easy in any phase. So I have decided to structure this talk along these 3 lines. So we'll first actually talk a little bit about coal and climate change. Where do we stand? What is why are we interested? What is the state of the debate? Then I would like to actually put a little bit emphasis on why countries still invest in coal. They do quite a bit, focusing on wrong incentives, financing costs, and vested interests. And then I would like to talk a little bit about where to go and what some possible steps forward might be. So most of you probably know that, but I still would like to bring this up because I think it really nicely illustrates our problem here. So when we think about climate change, we have a constraint in terms of how many greenhouse gases the atmosphere can actually absorb. There has been some debate with like the recent IPCC special report 1.5 degrees has been released, but still like the nature of the problem doesn't change. So there is a scarcity in the atmosphere, but on the other side, like we have a lot of fossil fuel resources and reserves in the ground that by far exceed what we can actually put in the atmosphere. And if we take climate change mitigation seriously, then this means, this is drawing on data from the AR5, that most of those, and when it comes to coal, depending on whether we have CCS available or not, depending on the scenario, but at least 70% of these reserves and resources have to remain in the ground. And this has implications actually for how we imagine the pathway towards this 2 degrees or much lower than 2-degree world might look like. And I would just like shortly actually say a few words about the structure of these mitigation pathways, because I think it illustrates nicely why it is so important to think a little bit about coal. So this is a typical mitigation pathway. The orangish color shows you basically a business as usual INDC world, and the bluish is all kinds of scenarios that calculate actually the achievement of a well below 2-degree scenario. So the first step we would need to do is redirecting investments from fossil to low carbon and efficiency solutions with a peak in emissions soonish in 2020. And then what we see until the year 2050 is actually the power sector decarbonization with the coal phase out until the mid of the century. I will talk a little bit more about that just to kind of complete this picture. Then most of these scenarios achieve a carbon neutral economy by 2060, 2070. So there are huge challenges still ahead of us in terms of freight transport, heavy industry, etc. So coal is not everything, but it really is the entrance into the kind of steep mitigation pathways. And then towards the end of the scenarios, a lot of those scenarios also talk about net CO2 removal. So going back to coal, like when looking into these scenarios, and these scenarios are looking at different ambition levels. So our colleagues from the integrated assessment models like to give them fancy names like B1400, B200, but it's actually saying something about the ambition level here. The greenish scenarios achieve 1.5 degree warming scenario with high probability. The purple one has only a medium probability for remaining below 2 degrees, but independent of where we are heading. So if we take the Paris Agreement seriously to stay well below 2 degrees, then this is actually what our scenarios say, and this is we have to get out of coal quite soon. And compared to what I've shown you before, this is actually what is ahead of us in the next decade. So these are the changes between 2020 and 2030 on a global level, and you can see that actually, depending on the scenario, and these are different scenarios, so there's a median here, always indicated by this line, and the median values actually say we have to phase out coal by 30 to 70% compared to 2020 levels, so 2019, so basically compared to today's levels. 10 years from now have to go down by 70% if we want to achieve 1.5 degrees with high probability. So now this thing leaves me alone. This is unfortunate. Okay, great. So I do not want to hide that there are some good news, particularly in the power sector. So the good news is that technological progress seems to be much faster than expected and also than we expected in the past. So I have a colleague at MCC who did a calculation how reality has performed against our assumptions in the scenarios from the past. So basically you can see all kinds of different scenarios, how they have actually imagined how PV picks up until today. The red line shows you what has actually happened. You can see that none of the scenarios but one, the Greenpeace scenario, has actually been right in estimating how PV has actually come into the market and how costs have fallen. So this is good news. But still, the bad news is that so as we actually care about the climate, we care about this curve. This curve shows us the CO2 emissions per year, and they have been halted or stalling a little bit in the last, let's say, 3-4 years. But the most recent numbers tell us that they are going up again on the global level. I've already mentioned that in the introduction, that this, of course, also has implications for the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And coal plays a very important role here when we look into the CO2 budget. So I've mentioned that before. If we talk about climate change mitigation, we have a certain budget in the atmosphere that we can fill. This is actually how this budget is already eaten up by current investments. So this here is basically all sectors without coal, so including buildings, including transport sector, etc. And this is actually what is happening in the coal sector, so including existing coal under construction and plan. And here it gets really interesting, because if you compare it to the budget that is shown on the right, that we still have for 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, you can see that coal is really eating into the budget. And this is not actually considering all kinds of other infrastructure that we actually still might want to build. Think of emerging and developing countries. This is not including emissions from agriculture, etc., or deforestation, not to speak of. So it's interesting to look a little bit in who is building coal. Like the country that is hidden up there is China. But actually, I like this representation, even though it is by chance, because my point here is that we have been looking at China quite a bit. So China has been building a lot of coal in the recent decades or so. But my point here is that it is actually other newly industrializing countries and developing countries that seem to follow this pathway into huge countries. So actually what you can see here is coal-fired power plants planned and under construction, ordered actually by the amount of gigawatts in which countries. So China's first, and India, Vietnam, Turkey, etc., etc. And the reddish and greenish dots here, they show you the percentage increase of plants and constructed power plants since the year 2015. So since we have actually seen the Paris Agreement come to life. And you see that actually countries like Bangladesh, Egypt, Philippines, Pakistan, they have increased their plants by quite a bit. So Egypt, for example, by more than 700%, Pakistan by more than 100%, and so on. And if all these power plants were built, it would seriously challenge our chances to achieve the 2-degree targets if we assume that these plants are not shut off really way before the end of their economic lifetime. What I should say, and then I think I stop with this first overview part of my talk, is that like the location of the coal plants is not necessarily saying anything about who is investing in them. So this map is more or less the same as the graph you have seen before, just in the map. So the more reddish it is, the more capacity in coal is in the pipeline. And these two graphs are actually showing you where the banks and the investors are located, including bonds and shareholders. And what you can see is that it is actually developed countries like the US, like Germany, also quite a bit from Australia, that is still investing and financing coal. So even though it might look that developed countries are more or less out of the coal investment business, it might not be true if we look into the actual location of investors. So of course, the important question is, like, all of these countries and the governments, of course, they know very well about the challenges ahead of that come with climate change. So for example, I've worked a bit in Vietnam, but also in China, in India. They are very aware of the potential impact. So why do they still invest in coal? So I think one important aspect is that the social costs are in no way reflected in the prices. And this actually graph from the UNEP Gap Report 2018, released in November, shows you the effective carbon rate here and the CO2 emissions from energy use. So basically 100% is all the emissions in the OECD and G20 countries, so excluding actually the poorer countries. And this is in euro the range that economists think would be the carbon price that is necessary as a start to achieve the 2-degree targets. And what you can see is that 90% of the emissions in the energy sector are not priced or not priced at a sufficient amount. And then there is 10% that are. Some of them are actually priced much higher. And this is actually mostly in the transportation sector, also reflecting on climate externalities. And in fact, and this is not shown in this graph, but there was an IMF study in 2015 calculating the subsidies for CO2, and they came up with a quite impressive number of $150 of subsidies per ton of CO2, actually. So this is, of course, quite an uphill battle if we would like to phase out coal, if there are subsidies for every ton of CO2 that is emitted. So the second thing, and this is something that I would like to explain a little bit more in detail, because this is from our developed countries' perspective, sometimes an issue that is highly neglected, and this is the question of financing costs for energy-related investments. So if you imagine an investment into coal or an alternative such as solar, photovoltaic, or wind, then you have a very major difference in the cost structure of these investments. So over the entire lifetime, a lot of the costs for coal appears in the future in terms of the fuel you actually have to ship in the power plant. Whereas for wind or solar, you invest everything up front, then it stands there, and sun and wind is for free. Which sounds like a huge advantage, turns out to be quite a disadvantage in developing countries. Why? Because in those countries, actually, the investment, the financing costs for getting all this capital up front are significantly higher than in our countries. This paper from 2014 is arguably quite old. Don't look so much at the numbers, which would show you the life cycle costs of electricity, and they have come down quite a bit for the technology on this side, the technologies on this side, so on the renewable energy, but still, the general point is still valid. If we have a developing country where, like, the costs of capital are by 50, 100% or more higher than they are here in Australia or in Germany, where we actually had de facto negative interest rates for a time, right? So no problem to get capital and investment. Then you can see what it does to the LCOEs, and you can see that for renewable energies, it increases the cost quite significantly by up to 40%. Whereas for coal and other fossil fuels, it does not have a major effect. So this is actually a major thing. And At MCC, we did a calculation. Okay, if we ignore this and we just get the incentives right, so my first point, actually get the prices right, and we introduce a carbon price of 50 tons, and we actually ran a small model and wanted to know, okay, what do like high weighted average cost of capital do to the energy system if we also apply, like if we apply a carbon price. And if we have no issues with actually capital costs, so weighted average cost of capital are 0 or very low, then you can see that it happens what we would actually like to see. So so in this world, we immediately, by just putting the 50 tons, $50 per ton CO2 price, and we get a high share of solar and wind in this model. But as soon as we get to ranges of 15 or higher percent, then the effect just disappears. And this is exactly the range where we are at. So for example, in Vietnam, they calculate with 14.5%. In Indonesia, they have like quite comparable numbers, and these are exactly the countries that build. And then there is the point that is much more difficult to actually track with numbers. It is a little bit more looking into, the dark side of the game, so to say, and this is about vested interest. This is current research we are conducting at MCC, where we actually try to go to most of these countries and talk to people, have semi-structured interviews, compare those results in the end. This is like work in progress, so I don't have a slide on that. But I can give you a couple of examples what these vested interests actually could be like. And for example, in India, we have in the poorest regions of the east of India, there are 10 to 20 million people that directly or indirectly depend on coal mining. So you can imagine that it is politically very hard to say, well, guys, that's it, we phase out coal. In Indonesia, the coal industry has been quite big in financing the election campaign of the president, who is up for re-election this year. So he has not really done anything that hurts the coal industry. Actually, we've been talking to the CEO of the Indonesian Coal Association, and he said, we are very happy with the current government. So these things, and I should also say that in Indonesia coal makes approximately 5% of the state budget. So it's actually a source of huge revenues. And then there are other forms of vested interest, like people who take the decisions who actually really benefit personally by, for example, the supply chains of coal, like the transport. You have to get away the ashes, etc. You have to transport it. This is where people actually can benefit and profit personally from, and this is something that that of course plays a role when we look into a national policy context. As I said, we try to get our hands on systemizing this work. It is work in progress, partly also done in the Energy Transition Hub, and I hope to come here again in a couple of years to present you more solid results that go beyond anecdotal evidence. But it surely plays a role. So let's talk a little bit about steps forward. The first thing is, I think, if we talk about a phase out of coal, we should have in mind that there might actually be a sequence of phase outs. And what am I referring to? So this graph shows you the energy generation from coal in different countries. The bluish countries are OECD countries, US, EU, other OECD countries. The yellowish, reddish countries are non-OECD countries. And the first graph here shows you the energy generation from coal. You can see that actually, particularly after 2005, unfortunately, it's not really well readable, but this is 2005 to 2009, 2010 to 2014, 2015 to 2017. Like coal generation has really increased in non-OECD countries, which in turn means that the coal power plant fleet in those countries is relatively new, whereas in OECD countries, the fleet is relatively old. So you can see that actually the peak of this distribution here, if you look at this, oh, sorry, this is actually in the 1970s, 1970 to 1980, where most of the power plants in OECD countries actually were built that are still online. So arguably, they are reaching the end of their lifetime anyway, so phasing them out will probably be less harm than phasing out like brand new power plants here from 2011 to 2017, where most of the power plants by non-OECD countries were built. So having this in mind might actually imply immediately who wants to go first, and then others can follow. I think the second very important thing, despite the issue of capital costs, etc., that I have mentioned, is that the coal transition should be embedded in broader climate policy, including carbon prices. And the nice thing when we talk about carbon prices is that they generate significant revenues. Again, this graph is from last year's gap report, showing all G20 countries and what a carbon price of 30 or 60 euros, like dark or light blue, would actually do in terms of emissions. So it would reduce it quite significantly by 40% in China, for example, or by 20-something% in Australia. And it could generate significant revenues. So this is in terms of GDP. So you can see that in some countries it goes up to 7%, but also here in Australia it would be somewhere around 1.5% of the GDP in terms of public revenues, which then of course can be distributed to pay off those that might actually lose from such a transition. I would like to say some more words about that. Then in terms of particularly developing countries, also developed countries, but developing countries, we often hear the argument, well, but the carbon price, this is a really regressive instrument, so it majorly hurts the poor. We did some research on that, and this is from a nice paper that just has come out that we did with a PhD student, Ira, of ours, and we calculated actually the effect on the lowest income group relative to the national average, so whether they would be more or less affected than the national average in a homogenized data set of 87 countries. And you can see that in most countries, actually, the effect would be progressive. So this is indicated by the green colors here. So the lowest income group would be less affected than the average, which would mean that, like, over time, eventually, also inequality would decrease. Well, there are a lot of other factors, but so this would actually be a good thing. But still, of course, it can still hurt the poor. So even it might be progressive, it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt the poor. So this is the income effect for the lowest group. And you can see that it can, in some countries, be quite dramatic. So going up to 5.5%, like if you're a very poor household, 5.5% less income can be quite substantial. But as I've shown, you also have revenues, and you can use them to recycle them back to households. This is work by my colleagues David Kleinert, Linus Mattauch, and others that was published in Nature Climate Change last year, and they ranked different recycling mechanisms by efficiency, equity, and acceptability. And this is indicated here by pluses and minuses. And you have all kinds of possibilities of, for example, decreasing the labor tax or the capital tax, or have directed transfers, or to, like, for example, the poorest income groups, or uniform transfers. This is something that British Columbia, the province in Canada, has made some good experiences with. So there are all kinds of possibilities. So you might say, okay, all this requires somehow good institutions, and you are right. We have looked with a more focus on developing countries, and this is also quite of a theoretical exercise, but still we were curious whether the amount of funds that you could generate by a carbon price that would actually be in line with the 2-degree target would be sufficient to finance other societal goals and forms of the SDGs. And we calculated for all of these developing countries whether it would actually suffice to cover the public investments. And you can see that in the bluish countries, it would, like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Egypt, all sound familiar from my very first graph, right? So in those countries, actually, the carbon price would be sufficient to cover their public investment needs to fulfill the SDG agenda. So access to electricity, but also health issues, etc. You name it. Coming to my last point I would like to make is that I think that in any case, transition will need political guidance. And this is despite all these positive welfare effects you might see, like these positive effects on the climate, etc., maybe less pollution, you name it. There will be people who lose from a coal transition. And this is nothing. And this actually might trigger kind of some severe resistance. And this is from West Virginia, where miners actually say go home to tree huggers. But the good thing is that you could actually think how to target those groups. So in terms of workers, think of social protection, dialogue. You also have to think of the coal owners and industry who might be compensating. So I've already shown that actually covering the carbon brand, so to say, might activate a lot of funds that you could use for coal phase-out agreements, etc. And then, last but not least, energy users. So you and me who might actually have to pay a higher bill for electricity. But here also we could actually think of compensatory redistributive policies, cash transfers. I mentioned some of them already before. And why I think this is in particular important is shown on this map, and this is actually drawing on work from a German trade economist, Jan Steckel, who has actually done work on trade exposure on the American county level. And he has actually looked at how basically different counties have been exposed by Chinese trade imports and how this has particularly affected the labor force, so the jobs. And he has compared that, and he did it in a more statistical, robust way, but it's still actually nicer for illustration. He's compared that to the votes in the 2016 election for Trump and how actually the Republican vote share has actually changed. And you can already see by these maps, there's quite a high correlation. So my argument here would be that if we do not really manage those transitions, take care of the people's fears that actually are losing jobs, that not to speak of the very strong identity issues that are connected to coal, which is, I've told you, I've been traveling in New Zealand. New Zealand has a very small coal industry. We've been to a coal region, all of a sudden, like all the signs, the pubs, like how it all looked like in the German coal regions, like people were like, seemed to be so identifying so much with this coal mining thing for some reason, I don't know, but like it seems to be important to talk to them carefully and explain them why this is actually important and also offer them something they can accept. In this respect, I can report a little bit of what we are doing in Germany. This is called the German Coal Commission. It's not the official name. The official name is much more difficult. I can't remember. But actually, it was an expert commission that was asked to give recommendations to the government how to phase out the German coal. Here we talk majorly about lignite. So Germany has a lot of lignite, more or less 20, 25 gigawatts of lignite capacity in the country. And it was including all kinds of people, scientists, but also people, politicians, unions from the affected unions. And this is the result. So we will phase out coal until 2038. We start with the timetable, phase out 12.5 gigawatts until 2022, like the total capacity is around 45 gigawatts. And then I think this is interesting. So they agreed to invest more than 40 billion US dollars in the affected areas. For example, high-speed trains, universities, etc. Relocate federal government jobs. So Germany has a tradition to have federal government agencies all over the place, not only in Berlin, but in many places. So those regions are supposed to get new ones. Reducing domestic power bills, compensate the energy-intensive industry for the loss of cheap power, and avoid the clearance of the Hambach forest, which caused quite a lot of struggle. So a lot of people actually going there protesting. The forest was squatted, actually. And yeah, it was a huge debate before they actually came up with their proposals. But however, I mean, this was a commission. I think it will be politically difficult to just ignore it, but it has not been put into any law so we have to see how the government now deals with that. But still, I think the process to bring everybody to one table and talk is actually, it might actually be a good example. So let me summarize. So I think there's not much time to phase out coal if we want to achieve our climate targets, of course. There's no one-size-fits-all strategy. We need some tailor-made country-specific strategies, but we still can say that probably if we don't get the prices right, then like phasing out coal remains an uphill battle despite technological improvements in alternatives. It seems to be key to have a management of the transition, and we should account for, and this goes together with this point, should account for that we will get actually some funds from having a price on carbon that can be used to manage these. And we should also account for these important identity questions. And with that, I think we can have a nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Just while you're considering questions, it's probably worth saying that the Energy Transition Hub is planning a series of seminars on coal transition issues over the next 3 or 4 months, including we've got Lars Kernan and others here working on the Latrobe Valley work. There will also be presentations by Frank Yotzo from Australian National University and myself around Australian coal phase out strategies and a number of other seminars. So stay tuned, I guess. This is the first of a number, I think, that will be including, I should add, also all the questions around addressing labour market and the issues facing vulnerable workers and communities and so on. So stay tuned. So as I said, can you please use the microphone because we're streaming? And can you please introduce yourself and say who you are and, if appropriate, where you're from?
Yes, I'm Hans Baer in the School of Social and Political Sciences. Probably a lot of people here already know me, but that point aside, Jan, my bigger question, and I'm very much an advocate of a steep carbon tax and renewable energy sources. But the bigger question for me is how much energy do we need? Under the existing capitalist world system, you need a hell of a lot of energy. So I'm wondering what you think about proposals that we transition to something different, an eco-socialist system, a degrowth economy, at least in the developed countries. So there are a lot of proposals to move entirely beyond the existing system, because what you're talking about is tweaking the system, but maybe it's time to move beyond the system. What are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I mean, I know this debate, like we are currently actually writing a paper together with quite a few people to kind of wrap up all the arguments and these degrowth arguments, climate change, etc. But my question to you in return would be, so how long have we now tried to abolish capitalism for? Maybe 150 years? And how much time do we have to solve the climate problems? Maybe 10 years. So I simply don't believe that all of a sudden, like people will raise up, have a revolution, say, well, you know, I don't need my big car, my big house, etc., etc. Particularly if you look into the global population structure. So maybe here, like in our intellectual bubble, and I say our because I mean, I agree with a lot of things you said. Do I need all this energy? Do you need my car? I can go by bike. Do you need to be here in Australia actually to fly over from Europe to more or less be on vacation? I mean, yes, shame on me. But like maybe it is already hard for us in our bubble, and like how hard it is to tell this to somebody in Vietnam who's actually now just maybe got his first motorbike, aspiring to buy their first car. And I just simply think this is a timing issue, and we might not have the time to think of
I would say that we need to look at ourselves. I don't think we can expect Vietnam and other developing countries to pay the lead. We have to pay the lead. And I would argue that you need to seriously think about degrowth.
Hans, if I can just get you to grab a microphone, because we're missing all of this on the line.
Yes, sorry. So for the people online, I think Hans was making a comment about we need to start with ourselves in the developed economies. Yeah.
My argument then simply would be to start with ourselves and to actually, we still, maybe I'm too much of an economist, I don't know, but then we actually need the incentive structure. So we need governments to actually put up the right policies for that. And I think like a carbon price would be, like you say, it is just tweaking the system. Maybe it is, but I still think that like when we talk about climate change, let's tackle the problem like of emissions, and let's have this discussion about what is the right economic system. Do we actually have gone too far with neoliberalism? All kinds of these questions, I think they are very important in this debate. But we still can say something without saying something about that, how like independent of like whether we talk about degrowth, whether we talk about like some green growth, like I think also in the degrowth world, you would need some kinds of policy instruments and cannot just rely on people all of a sudden like say, yeah, you know, I don't need my car.
So I've got a couple of questions. I'm also keen to, I've got 3 or 4 male questions. I'm keen to get a bit of a gender balance as well. Well, yes, I take your point. Yeah, I will actually go to Lee. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much. One of the, to take up your last point about the policy and legal instruments, I'm Lee Godden from the law school, so it was a good segue. Do you think carbon pricing will work alone? I noticed that you said that carbon pricing needed to be embedded within a suite of instruments and a broader policy. It's been one of my hobby horses for a long time that I don't think that carbon pricing alone is a sophisticated enough instrument to be able to achieve the climate policy goals. So therefore, you know, we really need to look at a suite of measures, including, if there is political will, some very direct regulation occurring through, for example, treating emissions like pollution. For example, you know, the efficiency of that is arguably more so, but of course you have a trade-off on political will. So just your thoughts there, thanks.
Yeah, no, I for sure think that it is cannot be the only mechanism around. So it would probably be embedded in a whole package, including policies and R&D, including policies that foster alternatives, including policies that actually might enable those technologies to enter the system. So think, for example, of investments into the electricity grid infrastructure and all of this. So I fully agree. So it can definitely not be the only instrument. However, I think that if we don't have a carbon price, then we might actually run into an equilibrium that looks very much like the German energy system. The German energy system, despite all our efforts to push renewables, and it has been successful. So like last year we have we had like 45% of our electricity came from renewable sources, wind and solar. Of course, this is great. If you just say that, oh, great, Germany. Then you should also say like where the rest came from. It was only coal and lignite, and our emissions have not decreased since 1990. Not in the electricity sector; they have in other sectors, but since 1994. So yeah, I think to actually avoid this development, you need to give a price to carbon, and then you can think of this will not work by itself. So you need to think of other smart regulations.
So I have a question down here, Jim.
Hi, I'm Jim Falk. I'm in the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and also, probably for my sins, I'm chairman of the board of directors of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, which, as you probably know, has, as an international, as a global organisation, has its #1 goal to hasten the inevitable decline of the use of coal. They try to develop what strategies they can, which are things like trying to oppose and take away financing for the Adani proposals, hanging off flagpoles in Canberra, and a lot of lobbying as well of potentially incoming governments. So the question I really have to ask is given this really fascinating presentation you've made, which I found very interesting, a lot of stuff that's summarised in a beautiful way. What role do you see for civil society organisations? What advice, perhaps even more interestingly, might you give to ones that are trying to move in the directions you are plotting?
Pretty difficult question, but thank you for that. I think like what I personally find, which is very important and what civil society can do, is to keep this topic kind of on the political agenda and to remind policymakers, we have a problem here, and to bring it up and up and up and up again. So for example, I think in terms of the Coal Commission, just like given the German example, I think it was very important that civil society was very actively, I told you about squatting those forests. It was all over the place in the media. It was top number one news story, and like how to deal with this issue, and like also like the effect of this student strike, like it is in the media everywhere. So like this might sound like, okay, what can you do? But you get like the attention, and yeah, I think it actually puts some constant pressure on policymaker and raises the awareness. And the second, of course, is the second is don't give up hope. This is important. And the third is, I mean, I sometimes feel, and this is what I do not want. There are issues with the German Coal Commission, and I do not want to kind of say all the time, right, Germany, like. But what I think is important is that everybody was willing to sit down at one table. And this sometimes as well, this of course goes to the industry associations, but it also goes to the civil societies organization, because sometimes I hear them saying, we don't talk to them, they are bad, they are the enemy. So, I mean, just imagine their position. What shall they do? They are losing actually their assets. I mean, yeah, they're probably also interested in a good future for the children, etc. So this would be my advice. I mean, try to see them as, I mean, they have their interest. They might not be actually in the sense of a social planner be interest, but they are like interests, and they might have their legitimacy in a way. So yeah, talk to them.
Question at the back.
Hi, Jan. My name is Jordan Panayotov, Independent Center for Analysis and Research of Economies. And just for the information of the audience, we did establish Global Working Group on Climate Change and Health in June 2010 in Geneva. Because of different reasons, the work did not progress, but this is not so important. It was just to give an idea that I have to the audience that I have an idea what I'm talking about. So I want to mention two very important points which you have pointed out. And it is that social cost is not taken into account when decisions are made. And this is very, very important. And I think that all progressive people should try to push it, to advocate for this, that social cost must be taken into account when decisions are made. And the second thing what you have pointed is that we need to have the right policies. Great, yes, this is it. And now the problem is that still most people, including most of the decision makers, are not aware of the fact that any policy or investment has impacts on population health, either direct or indirect, distant, immediate or distant, cumulative, and so on and so on. And this impact is not taken into account as well, because this is what makes the social cost. When you fire people, lay off people because you close mine, becoming unemployed, it has indirect impact on their health because of stress increased, less income, and so on and so on. When you have policies which are subsidizing solar panels for homeowners, you have indirect impact on health for renters because they are exposed to higher prices of electricity due to the fact that the manufacturers of energy are passing the cost to the users. So those who got the subsidy for solar panels are less exposed to the higher price of electricity. They have greater income, disposable income, compared to the renters. So all those things.
We might
the
need
question
to
is, okay, the question is, what methodology do you use in order to assess the impacts of different policy options in terms of social cost?
Thank you. So that's probably a largish question as well, but briefly.
Yeah, I mean, what I have cited here is a kind of a compilation of studies, right? So there are all kinds of different ways how you calculate the social cost of carbon or social cost of policies in any way, including kind of cost-benefit analysis, and you get in all kinds of debates and how to discount, how to value human life, how to value health, etc. Yeah, maybe we catch up offline a little bit on that, because it might.
Yeah. So I've got, I think, 2 or 3 questions left before we've got, we need to finish up. Lars, I might need a mic down here. So one down here, and then yes, we'll take this person over here.
Thanks, Jan. Lars Kunen from the Melbourne State Society Institute. I've had a question about the German Coal Commission, because if I look at the set of policy suggestions, it looks pretty much like business as usual. So what difference has the inclusion of the people that are affected really made, and who has been invited? Because civil society also consists of populist movements like the Yellow Shirts. So have these civil society organizations also been invited to these discussions?
So the Yellow Shirts, we don't have them, or at least when I left Germany, we didn't have them. I don't know what happened in the last 2 months, but so this was really a French thing, but we have other populist movements called Pegida and like all kinds of people. Honestly, I don't know, because as I said, like I had only very little time to look into the results of the commission. I have read that it was like the way it worked was that obviously the commission asked the not the federal but the state and below the states governments actually to make proposals what actually these investments could be targeted at, and then they had a week or so to put it together. So what they proposed was what they were thinking of anyway. But as far as I read it, it is very clear that these are examples. So they made a rough estimate of the amount of money that shall be directed to that, so it can be earmarked. But they also made pretty clear that these are examples. And before I left, there was quite a debate in the East German region, where they the Lausitz region, to build a high-speed train there. I think this is something that was new. I have never heard of that before, but I might be wrong. To also kind of invest a lot into the local university there also seemed to be new, but I might be mistaken.
And Jan, am I right in saying I think the Coal Commission had 25, 26 members, including
the second point.
NGOs like Greenpeace, I think, on the left,
Yeah.
but also premiers of conservative or mining dependent states?
Yeah.
So it was quite broad in that sense, yeah?
But yeah, it didn't outspokenly include some of the populist movements,
Yeah,
but I think it's fair to say that it did include I think unions from the region, from miners' unions, etc. That then I would say might pick up some of these movements, but I'm not sure. So, I mean, you raised a very important question. So, and this is something that I think of more in general terms, unrelated to this talk. Actually, how do you get to those people that kind of have, left this discourse and say, okay, we just don't want to talk to you, you are the enemy, or as I said earlier, right? So as soon as somehow the willingness to discuss and accept that the other person has a valid argument, if that ends, then it becomes really difficult. And this, to my reading, is what often happens with populist movements. So we had lesson in France where it was really on having a carbon tax on fuels. In Germany, we have experienced the rise of the populist movements in relation to migration issues in the last years. And yeah, it seems to be very difficult to get together and just talk, because as soon as you identify yourself to be on one or the other side, then you immediately don't want to talk to you.
So I've got two final questions, I think. The two gentlemen in front here.
Alex Arbuthnot, and I'm a farmer and a Gippsland farmer, and thank you for your presentation. I'd have to say this is probably one of the best I've heard, and your words of wisdom. Coming from Gippsland, do you think there is a role for coal in producing the likes of hydrogen, which is certainly a use that can be used to help us in the transition?
Oh, I mean, this is a rather technical question. I don't know. It might be. But as long, maybe to put it very generally, as I don't have a clue about the technological details, but as long as it continues to release carbon, then I do not really see a future for coal in that technology. And there are other ways to produce hydrogen, I guess, that might be more environmentally friendly.
And the gentleman here.
Martin Drerup, Melbourne. Just a quick thing, Newton's third law says that for every action there's an equal action. That's just an aside. Energy is a fundamental issue which we're all faced with. My understanding, and I ask Jan to confirm this, is that about 35% of energy in the developed world is electrical energy.
I don't have the numbers, but it for sure plays a very important role.
My question really is, are we disproportionately focusing on coal and CO2 as opposed to the fact that there are enormous other sources of energy, and the real nigger in the woodpile, or whatever you want to call it, and I'm being very racist there, is population growth. 7.5 billion people are going to become 10 billion people. That's a 1/3 increase in demand. Where is that being discussed?
I have shown like a couple of scenarios at the very beginning that actually account for population growth. So they usually account for median, so it depends, and you have, in those scenarios, you have, again, a lot of variation, including like a world with high population growth, with low population growth. So like the scientific community has calculated that through, and then you get different baselines and kind of like what you need to do. The essence actually is always the same. Like this kind of steep emission reduction, which is mainly in the power sector, is independent of whether or not we have population growth in the future. So this increase in demand, as you rightly said, it adds an additional difficulty, yes, but it does not change anything from the more structural changes that we need.
So in a second, I'm going to ask you to thank Jan. Two quick comments by way of conclusion. I mean, I too found the observations very valuable, and I'm always struck listening to Jan, particularly being reminded about the challenges and the importance of action in Australia, but also the significance of particularly the investment in coal in emerging and developing economies, and the social distribution and social equity implications of that. And I think that's very valuable insights. Before also I ask you to thank Jan, an advertisement for the next seminar on 4 p.m, I believe, on Friday by Professor Miles Allen from Oxford, which will be on addressing the question of, as I understand it, the extent to which we need to and can take account of, in a sophisticated way, negative emissions and carbon capture questions in hitting emissions reduction targets. So I'm sure that will be a valuable and interesting conversation. Could I ask you please to thank Jan for his talk? Thank you. So my understanding is that point one, the talk has been recorded and will be available, and the slides will be available shortly as well. So yes.
Thank you.